Hello there, welcome to another episode of Ringgit Sense, the show where we talk about money. I'm Azara Tagayat, your host, and in today's show we discuss a topic that has been consistently brought up from time to time: inflation, or the rising cost of living. Now, you know how prices of things you pay for keep increasing, but as a consumer, we need to understand the causes in order for us to really grasp where all that money is going. Why are things getting more and more expensive? Well, first up, we went out to a local market to find out how inflation has affected consumers and what they're doing to adapt to current situations.
I think kalau macam perbelanjaan barang-barang sini, kita datang seminggu sekali. Jadi kalau orang lain belanja cara lain lah, mak lah. Macam kami, kita sekurang-kurangnya kalau sekali datang, kita belanja dalam dekat RM330-50.
Kalau setakat beli ikan, beli udang, dalam 500.
Usually I do the marketing on a weekly basis. One time I buy is about 300 for everything, including the vegetable, fish, chicken, about 300 per week.
Oh, dulu RM100 cukup untuk seminggu. Kalau dulu kita RM100 untuk 5 orang, 6 orang makan. Tapi sekarang RM100 kalau untuk 5-6 orang memang tak cukup.
Probably due to the economy no good, and of course a lot of things like increasing, like the petrol, the currency, and it is probably like, you know, related to all these things and causing the price increase.
Satu bab lagi inflasi lah. Pada saya inflasi.
So, while talking to people on the street on what the most common reasons are for inflation in Malaysia, you might hear a few key answers: GST, rising fuel cost, and the low currency value. But what are the real factors that affect inflation? With us in the studio today is Dr. Muhammad Afzanizam Abdul Rashid, the Chief Economist from Bank Islam, to talk to us about this topic. Hello, Doctor. Thank you for joining us on Ringgit Sense.
You're welcome.
Okay, so speaking about inflation, what are the main causes of inflation in Malaysia, let's say in the past 3 years, the most recent things that are affecting the prices in Malaysia?
I would say there's a few, various reasons, various dimensions to it, obviously. For one thing, the depreciation of ringgit may have some important implications in terms of inflation, because especially on food, we imported some of the main items in food. So when there's a depreciation of ringgit, definitely it will transmitted into the local prices. That's one. Number two, I would say the adjustment or the upward adjustment in the administered prices, like, you know, sugar prices, cooking oil, flour, and perhaps some related services like LRT. It was announced a few years back, and then it sort of, you know, bump up the prices. So and I would say the last factors will be the demand pressure itself. I think last week when the Bank Negara announced the increase in the overnight policy rates by 25 basis points, is actually one of the things is to temper down this demand pressure, because we have seen growth in last year. I think at least in the first 9 months, the economic growth has been quite strong, 5.9%, and we have seen improvement in terms of consumer spending. So it gives some impression that there's a demand pressure which needs some policy response from the central bank.
Okay, a lot of people are blaming GST, that they need to pay more for stuff that before might not have cost as much as now. So what do you have to say about that, about GST in Malaysia?
Yeah, I think it affects various prices, and that also includes GST. So yeah, there's truth in it. And then we can see in terms of say communication prices, which is part of the components in the consumer price index. When the announcement of GST, you can see the index of communication that includes the subscription, the the prepaid expenses, the prices is bumped up during that year. So yeah, there's truth in it. So actually there are various factors that causes why there's inflation, and the nature of prices. I think this is quite important. Is what economists term it as a price sticky downward. Meaning when there's price increase, it's quite difficult to come down because of businesses might somewhat reluctant to bring it down, even though there's advantage in the cost.
Yeah.
Even though another term to it is actually menu cost. Basically, menu cost, we say that it's a costly affair to change prices, like whatever printed on the menu. Suddenly there's a price change. So business may not want to change the price because there's a cost to it, and there's a increase in demand. So why bother to change prices when there's
people are still buying it?
Yeah, exactly. So from business point of view, it makes them less motivation to reduce prices. So these are the situation that we call price sticky downward. It's very difficult to come down.
Okay.
So it's quite prevalent in that sense.
Okay, so what if GST were to be removed? Would inflation go down?
I doubt it. I mean, we have seen fuel prices have been adjusted downwards several times. But if you look at the trend of the consumer price index, the level over the years is progressively rising. Take, for instance, last year, the inflation has been rising about 3.7%. This year, I mean, our in-house forecast, we are looking inflation to be somewhere around 3%. Although there's some moderation from, let's say, assuming it's 3%, it materializes. From 3.7 to 3%, it doesn't mean that price are actually declining. No, it's actually the pace of appreciation is slowing. But the fact that remains, 3% is actually on top of 3.7% increment last year. So price level is actually continuing to increase.
It's still growing.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing that's been mentioned, aside from GST and fuel prices, are also the currency value.
Right.
So how do you see the ringgit versus the dollar in the coming years?
Well, I think we have seen ringgit has been trading around, now today it's about 3.86. So it should translate some reducing in inflation pressure as a result of the imported inflation. I think in the last Bank Negara statement, when they announced their decision on OPR, they did mention about the effect of exchange rate appreciation could actually mitigate the inflation rate. So I think that would help to a large extent in reducing the inflation pressures as a result of the appreciation of ringgit.
Will that bring down the prices of food then?
Well, I'm not saying price will come down, but at least stabilize.
Okay.
So that's why when we see the expected inflation, say about 3% this year, from 3.7%, I think is much better than, if inflation rate continue to go up beyond 3.7%. Even at 3%, it's still high.
Yeah.
If you look at the longer term trend, inflation rate since 1990s, the inflation is around 2.8%. So at 3%, it's still high.
I see. Okay, good points there. And well, we're going to take a short break. More with Dr. Afzal Nizam after this. After the break, we'll be talking about the government, what the government is actually doing to help consumers and how consumers themselves are adapting to the rising cost of things. More on that when we come back on Ringgit Sense.
People tend to buy less now, see. So they still need to buy all the fishes. They buy less though. Not like last time they buy a lot.
Yang 3 tahun lepas harga barang taklah berapa mahal. Ayam masa itu kita jual baru RM6.80 sen. Sekarang ni kita jual atas meja, sekarang ni ayam sudah melambung naik harga RM9.
Perbezaan harga tu ada bang, tapi kira daripada dulu sekarang sama je bang. Cuma dulu barang murah, harga dia pun lebih kurang, tapi pendapatan kita kurang. Macam sekarang pendapatan banyak tapi harga barang tetap mahal. Dia punya keadaan dia sama, cuma kita nampak dia meningkat je lah harga dia.
All the pricing increase, like this salmon last time about 40 ringgit, now 70 ringgit.
Nak buat macam mana? Terpaksa lah kita, customer marah juga lah. Pasal apa barang mahal.
But the supplier keep us expensive. Of course, we just make it about 20% like that only.
You're still with me, Azara Tagaya, on Ringgit Sense, and we are still with our guest, Dr. Muhammad Afzani Abdul Rashid, Chief Economist at Bank Islam. And today we're talking about inflation, or the rising cost of things. Okay, Doctor, back to our discussion. Now, before the break, you mentioned that inflation can actually benefit those in the import sector, working in the import sector. So could you say that inflation can actually help the economy somewhat?
Yeah. Because if you look at in the food sector, for instance, if you look at self-sufficiency level for milk, it's just around 5%, meaning another 95% we need to import. So those companies like in this business of food that relates to dairy products, you know, when they import with this kind of exchange rate, I think it will give them some added advantage in terms of their costs. So in that sense, their margin will be expanded, and perhaps they can remain competitive. Perhaps maybe provide some, you know, more activities in terms of promotional, and then perhaps some slight reduction in prices to get a better market share. And that's for food industry. For automotive, yeah, especially on parts. And then this could actually reduce business costs among the automotive industry. So, yeah, it does give some added advantage to the importers when the ringgit is appreciated.
I see. Okay. Now, as an economist, could you help to bring light on some of the recent policies that have been carried out by the government to actually help consumers, and how have these policies actually helped Malaysians so far?
Well, I think when we talk about how the government could actually help, two things come to our mind. Obviously, the cash transfers through BRIM, and obviously subsidies. So we have seen government has been actively using this policy instrument to address this problem. But I think perhaps along the way we need to do some tweaking. Say, for instance, BRIM, because it's everything the same across the board, irrespective the number of members in the households, irrespective of the location. So perhaps going forward, we should see some tweaking in terms of the recipient of BRIM, in terms of the amount based on the location and based on the number of households. You know, that should give some fair distribution in terms of cash transfers. But yeah, subsidies, that's true. To a large extent, it helps to mitigate the cost of the rising costs. But I think we have to bear in mind the government also having some limitations in terms of their finances. Just look at the trend in terms of the aging population in Malaysia is continuing to rise. So when we see an aging population, that is going to have some important bearings in terms of the revenue collections going forward. So it tells you that the government needs to be mindful with respect to their spending, whether to continue on subsidies or to continue on spending capacity building, such as education, health, and perhaps on infrastructure spending, because everything is so limited in terms of government finances. So focusing on one area alone may not resolve the whole issue at hand.
I see. What about some of the subsidies that have been removed for items such as fuel, and how has this actually affected inflation in recent years?
You can see that if you look at the inflation last year, we registered 3.7%, the headline numbers. But if you look at the transport sector, there it lies, you know, your around 95, and transport sector account about 13.7% of total CPI. So it has increased by 13.2% last year, after recording a negative growth for 2015 and 2016. So you can see a sharp increase in fuel prices. Yes, it is being reflected in prices whenever there is a adjustment in these so-called administered prices. You know.
Do you see the government removing more subsidies?
I think with rising oil prices at the moment, and then there's an appreciation of ringgit, and the economy continue to grow, I would say, an above trend, I think whatever we have now can be maintained in terms of subsidies. It gives some fiscal space for the government to continue its subsidies program. So I think I don't foresee any major disruption in terms of the subsidy expenditure because of the improving economic backdrop.
Okay, so that's somewhat good news for us. Okay, keeping on that trend though, what's your outlook for the coming year?
All right, because in terms of inflation, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at 3% growth in terms of inflation. So one of the main factors, obviously the base factor, because last year was high base, and then there is an element of appreciation of ringgit could actually help to mitigate the inflation. But we are still uncertain about the trajectory of fuel prices. We have seen Brent crude trading about $70 per barrel, a level that which beyond comprehension if you talk about this 12 months back, you know. So yeah, I think there's a risk, that upside risk to inflation, but yeah, so trajectory-wise is still high by historical standard.
Okay, so as a consumer, what would be your advice to people?
Okay, I think, like it or not, first we need to save. Second, we need to invest. Okay. Why save? Because it allows you, to capitalize on whatever opportunities on investment. But keeping your money under the pillow, chances are this money will be eroded by inflation. Therefore, you need to take some form of risk. And in town, I think there's a lot of opportunities. You can invest in stock market or even invest in unit trust. Even in stock market now these days, you can actually buy shares in Wall Street market. You can buy Apple shares, you can buy Facebook shares on your own, So, yeah, so I think as a consumers, obviously, like it or not, we need to be mindful on our spending and keeping tab in terms of opportunities in terms of investments. That's how we can actually beat the inflation factor.
Okay, very well. And thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, Chief Economist at Bank Islam, for sharing with us on Ringgit Sense.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so there you have it, the discussion on inflation. Hopefully you have some interesting takeaways from our topic today. We are going to be taking a short break. We'll be back after this on Ringgit Sense. Welcome back to Ringgit Sense. You're still with me, Azaria Tagaya. Now, of the many stories covered by our show last year, the most popular ones were on property investment. So this season, we'll be revisiting the topic, offering you more tips on how you can actually gain from property investment. Now, how can you get started and buy your first property? We speak to Faizul Rizwan from Far Capital Sendirian Berhad, who shares his top tips.
Faizul Rizwan first stepped into the property investment market at age 24 with only about 2,000 ringgit to start. A lecturer who taught him personal finance in college inspired him to invest in property. With only a salary of 2,500 ringgit, he started saving for 2 years while learning from anyone he could find about property investment. Fast forward to 2018 and he's close to signing a total of 50 properties under his name. We asked Faizul if it's possible for someone earning a monthly income of 3,000 ringgit or less to buy a property in the Klang Valley. Also, what should they look out for?
You can buy property, right? 3-bedroom property along MRT line, confirm station, walking distance, for less than 400,000. And the down payment required is 1,000 if you can get a 90% loan. So on top of that, you are given a cashback. So basically, your renovation fee of 20,000 later is covered lah. Like I said lah, but there's only 1 or 2 developments, the whole of Klang Valley that has this kind of attribute. So the question is that, do we have enough skill set or knowledge to go and being able to filter what is bad, decent, and good, right? So the key here is knowledge, not so much on the capital.
There are 3 things that defines the perfect property, according to him.
The perfect property, in my opinion, are property that can fulfill these 3 criteria. The first one is that when you want to sell the property, you don't have to sell at a loss. So that means you have to buy the property at a reasonable price point today. Number 2 is that when you want to rent the property, you either make a surplus, or even if it's a negative cash flow, the negative cash flow is not significant. A couple of hundred, acceptable, not a couple of thousand. The third one, which I think a lot of investor neglects, but not for us, is that it's very, very important that the property that you buy, on top of meeting those two criteria for investment, it also must be something that you like enough that you don't mind staying there. Right? So that means upon, let's say, completion or after 5 years, so you've got the option to rent it out, to sell it off, or to stay. To me, that's the perfect property. So that's why the perfect property for me and you will be completely different, because we always have certain area preference. Make sense? Now, is that easy to find? Incredibly difficult. With time, given enough homework, can.
We asked Faisal for his prediction for the property market this year. He expects the general election to be a major deciding factor.
It's general election year, right? Historically, in the last 2 elections, because there were uncertainty about the current ruling party and the current government, people are adopting a wait-and-see attitude. So typically, prior to the election, there's not going to be much activity going on. Okay. After election, however, should the current government remain, I expect things to pick up.
There are clients he does turn away, mainly because they don't believe in his investment philosophy. He believes that those who invest in property should do it for the long term and not buy and expect to sell it in the short term to make a quick profit.
Well, there you have it, some interesting viewpoints from Faisal Rizwan. That was actually the first part of our interview with Far Capital Sendirian Berhad. We'll be exploring more points with Faisal, so look out for that in future episodes. Next week, we ask him how to go about renting out your property. Also, with our guest in studio, we're going to help you save up to buy your first home. So if you have any questions about that, as usual, our Facebook page is Ringgit Sense TV3. Facebook is also where you can catch up on today's show and our previous stories. That's it from us. I'm Azaria Tagaya, and I will see you next week.